Welcome to this afternoon's plenary session, which is titled Against Canadian Nationalism, Solidarities Against Border Imperialism and Racial Capitalism. So I welcome the folks who are here in person and also the many people who are online who are joining us virtually today. It's wonderful to have so many people engaged. I'm delighted to introduce our presenter, Harsha Walia, who is a Punjabi Sikh writer and organizer based in Vancouver, unceded Indigenous Coast Salish territories. Harsha has been a grassroots organizer in migrant justice, anti-capitalist, feminist, abolitionist, and anti-colonial movements for the past 2 decades, including through collectives and coalitions such as No One Is Illegal, Defenders of the Land, and Anti-Capitalist Convergence. Her day gig is in an anti-violent service provider organization supporting survivors of gender-based violence. Harsha is the award-winning author of Border and Rule, Global Migration, Capitalism, and the Rise of Racist Nationalism, and Undoing Border Imperialism. She is also co-author of Never Home, Legislating Discrimination in Canadian Immigration, Red Women Rising, Indigenous Women Survivors in Vancouver's Downtown East Side, and Color of Violence, Race, Gender, and Anti-Violence Services in BC. And Harsha is also formally trained in the law. So please join me in giving a warm Parkland welcome to Harsha.
Thank you to the Parkland Institute for organizing this and bringing me here and bringing all of us together. So thank you to the Parkland. I am so honored to be here with all of you as we're gathered here on Indigenous lands that have been stolen by the Canadian colonial state and that continue to be devastated by Canadian colonial policies. Whether that's Mark Carney passing Bill C-5 that violates Indigenous lands and Indigenous consent, or David Eby in the province where I reside, a so-called NDP leader, purportedly leftist politician, but ramming through Bill C-14 and Bill C-15 on Indigenous lands to continue to extract resources, or Bill 54 here in Alberta. In Canada, despite state apologies for residential schools and proclamations of reconciliation, today there are more children who are apprehended through the child welfare system, what Black feminist Dorothy Roberts more aptly calls the family policing system, and placed into foster homes than ever were in residential schools. Hundreds of Indigenous communities continue to live with water boil advisories. Indigenous women, girls, trans, and Two-Spirit people continue to be targeted and hunted by a gendered colonial system and settler society across these lands. And somehow our political leaders can figure out how to drill and frack and mine, but can't figure out how to get food onto single mothers' tables and build schools for kids in the north. This is not a coincidence. This is the deliberate and ongoing dispossession and deliberate impoverishment of settler colonialism. As my friend, the late Secwepemc leader Arthur Manuel used to say, quote, "You cannot have reconciliation under the colonial 0.2% Indian reserve system. The land issue must be addressed before reconciliation can begin," end quote. So my talk today, which is titled Against Canadian Nationalism, has, of course, as my starting point this, that we have to remember that Canadian nationalism and Canadian nation building is completely inseparable from this ongoing reality and violence of colonization. While they may be individually motivated by different ideologies, the Canadian flag-waving freedom convoy of a few years ago and the Canadian flag-waving corporation pretending to be proudly Canadian are both rooted in the same myth-making of Canada, one that cannot escape the fundamentally white supremacist and profit-seeking reality of Canada as Indigenous genocide, Canada as enslavement of Black people, Canada as migrant exploitation, and Canada as imperialist missions around the world. Canadian colonialism is, of course, global in scope. Canada and Israel, for example, are shared settler colonial projects. We have all been watching in horror every day, so let me not recount the horrors of 2 years of genocide. Instead, let us hold the immense sacrifices of the people of Gaza, of the fathers singing to their babies, of the children feeding their beloved cats, of the doctors and healthcare workers refusing to abandon the injured, of the mothers sending their sons to the resistance, of the journalists who have exposed the entire world order and the sham of Western liberal democracy and so-called international law. Every day, every month, every year, and for so many decades, the Palestinian people, with spoons and stones and bulldozers raising down fences, remind us of the unbreakable spirit of Sumud and freedom. For us to stand in solidarity with the Palestinian people here in Canada necessarily means we must oppose Canadian imperialism, which includes Canadian-made weapons fueling the genocide in Palestine, and the Canada-Israel Free Trade Agreement that normalizes with the Zionist entity. It means we must oppose Canadian-made weapons going to the UAE-backed RSF militaries in Sudan. It means we must oppose Canadian imperialism, which includes opposing these military export agreements and these trade agreements, and also investment agreements that facilitate Canadian mining atrocities around the world, and knowing that these agreements are specifically sold to us under the guise of Canadian nationalism and Canadian nation building in order to continue rights violations all around the world. This rhetoric of Canadian nation building is, of course, most stark right now with Prime Minister Carney. The new budget, as we all likely know, doubles down on resource extraction on Indigenous land, doubles down on militarism and NATO's war machine, amounting to an almost 40% increase in defense spending. Doubles down on corporate subsidies, including massive new subsidies to LNG and fossil fuel, and massive restrictions on immigration. This particular emphasis on building up the military, police, and border agencies is both an appeasement to Trump, as we know last year Trump demanded more border restrictions in particular, and is also a militaristic defense state that we see being mimicked across Western and Central Europe today as a kind of bulwark to an increasingly unpredictable and multipolar world, or so we're told. Carney has specifically justified his so-called transformation and what he calls his vision through the language of, quote, reducing reliance on the US, resilience to global shocks, nation-building infrastructure, and selling to new markets. This is all in his words. Most notably, this kind of nation building, as we see in many of the announcements that have come out over the past few weeks and past few months, is particularly concerned with ports, pipelines, mines, and trade corridors. And this is specifically in order to sustain capital circuits and colonial extraction, while completely divesting from public services such as healthcare, education, childcare, and more. This is critical to note. Carney's neoliberal policies are not actually a real opposition to Trump or rising fascism. It is simply a method of saving capitalism. I want to focus here a bit on fascism so we can truly understand what an actual left progressive opposition to fascism would require. Liberals use fascism to identify uniquely authoritarian politicians, most obviously south of the border. Those who are exceptions to the status quo neoliberal order. However, fascism is actually a consistent feature of capitalist liberal nation states. Rather than an aberration, fascism operates through the everyday violences of colonial occupation, capitalist circuits of extraction, and racial terror. This is made perhaps most clear by Pan-Africanist Walter Rodney, who wrote, quote, "Fascism was a monster born of capitalist parents. Fascism came as the end product of centuries of capitalist bestiality, exploitation, domination, and racism, mainly exercised outside Europe," end quote. Fascism is thus not outside of liberalism and is not even illiberalism. It is, in fact, a persistent feature of liberal democracies and capitalist expansion. In his classic discourse on colonialism, Césaire identified that fascism in the metropole was the boomerang effect of European colonialism in the periphery and all around the world. This is exactly why we cannot be lured into thinking that liberalism or neoliberalism is an actual, meaningful antidote to fascism. In addition to resuscitating capitalism, another critical way in which neoliberalism and liberalism both feed off right-wing ideas is through the specific politics of scapegoating. Fascism and liberalism, to varying degrees, both turn the socioeconomic crisis of inequality that is created by capitalism against those who are already targeted. So that those who are targeted by race due to their citizenship, their sexuality, their gender, and so on. This is the specifically anti-trans, anti-immigrant, and anti-drug user, and anti-poor scapegoating that is increasingly familiar to us across every city in Canada. We see this mimicked through anti-trans discourses and policies here, of course, in Alberta. We see this in increasing police budgets in every city, justified with the rhetoric of crime and disorder on the streets. And we see this increasingly justified through anti-migrant policies, which I'll go into more depth. In particular, immigration is increasingly mobilized not only in Canada, but if we zoom out for a moment, in far-right circles all around the world. So not only in Canada, but in the US, as we see with the ICE terror raids, in India, in the EU, across Western and Central Europe, to Australia, to New Zealand, and beyond. Far-right appeals everywhere falsely target migrants for stealing jobs, for driving up housing prices, for draining services, and tainting cultural values. How many of us have heard this on a loop like every single day, right? Anti-migrant racism like this, like these kinds of tropes, deflect responsibility from capitalist austerity that are actually causing these crises and increases racism. It deflects from capitalism, that is the actual cause of mass impoverishment, and it conveniently scapegoats migrants, which actually makes migrants more vulnerable to capitalist exploitation, right? The more that we scapegoat and target migrants, the more that they become useful for capitalist bosses. Alberto Toscano, author of Late Fascism, remarks, quote, "Once migration is cast as a problem, it always rebounds to the benefit of the right and the liberals, who need not deliver solutions as long as it diverts social malaise away from structures and towards scapegoats," end quote. So again, this politics of scapegoating is so central to both liberalism and fascism, which is the second reason why liberalism absolutely cannot meaningfully counter fascist discourse, because it is actually the mirror to fascism when it comes to scapegoating-based politics. In Canada today, anti-migrant racism looks like migrants being held responsible for the housing crisis. Every day we are told that migrants are responsible for the housing crisis, that there is not enough housing, that migrants are driving up housing prices, when in fact the reality is that the housing crisis is a very clear policy choice. It is a policy choice since the dawn of colonization on these lands that's treated land as a commodity. It is a policy choice since the 1990s of austerity that turned housing rights and social housing into a speculative market with weak rent controls and absolutely almost no universal subsidized housing being built. And it is a result of a housing crisis because we continue to have a capitalist economy that treats housing as a profit motive rather than a human right. In Canada today, anti-migrant racism looks like migrants being blamed for unemployment and migrants being blamed for stagnant wages. We hear this from politicians across political stripes, which is part of how we know that liberalism is scary when, again, the so-called BC NDP, well, they are the NDP, but so-called progressive BC NDP, David Eby, literally mimics the talking points of conservatives. This is common, again, in cities and provinces across Canada where migrants are being blamed for unemployment, even though the facts on the ground are that Canada's 100 highest paid CEOs pocketed $13.12 million on average in a single year, while migrants are often the actual lowest paid workers across these lands. Migrants are not the ones stealing jobs. Migrants are the ones who are forced to do some of the most dangerous, cheapened labor on these lands. On average, these 100 CEOs who are billionaires and millionaires across Canada are paid 210 times more than the average worker's wage, right? So if we want to blame unemployment and low wages, we have to be very clear that it is the banks and the billionaires and the bosses who are responsible, not migrants. So many of us here are probably closely following what's going on in the US and the horrors of ICE, but we know less about how quickly Canada has metabolized and also reproduced anti-migrant racism to quickly and quietly grow its deportation machinery over the next few years. Can anyone tell me how much Canada is planning on increasing its deportation rate by in the next year or two? 25%. Still a big number. Big number. Still a big number. So it's planning on increasing deportations by 25%. And 300% would probably be what Canada wanted to do if it actually accepted any immigrants and refugees to begin with. So already in 2025, what we have seen is that the number of international students, who I would note here, actually subsidize our post-secondary education in an increasingly privatized system, as well as the number of migrant workers who, again, work some of the most dangerous and difficult and low-wage jobs in the fields, in the farms, as domestic labor, as construction workers, as retail workers. Both of these have together, on average, dropped by 53% over the past year and a half. 53%. Canada currently is accepting less than half the number of migrant workers and international students compared to approximately 18 months ago. Refugee claims, so asylum seekers who are protected by international law, who have an internationally governed right to asylum, have just been reduced by 30% compared to 2024, right? A system that is not supposed to actually have quotas, right? Because people are being displaced and fleeing for their safety, has been reduced by 30%. The federal Liberals have made so many cuts through these streams and more that has resulted in every single day 3,000 people losing their permits to remain in Canada. 3,000 people. Like today, the time that we were here at the Parkland Institute conference, 3,000 people in this country have lost their ability to remain here with their families and to work here and to study here every day. So on top of that, so this is what has already happened, and now the new Carney budget this past month further slashes refugee and humanitarian spots by another 10,000, cuts international students' numbers by half again, introduces copay that will deny refugees basic health care and is basically a way to continue to privatize a public health care system, and reduces temporary residence by another 43% compared to this year's 2025 numbers, right? So all in all, we are seeing massive, massive immigration restriction that very few of us know about. Carney is also pushing through Bill C-12. Have people heard about C-12? Bill C-12. So Bill C-12 up until about a month ago was Bill C-2. And Bill C-2 and Bill C-12 combined were basically anti-border policies and increased surveillance on all Canadians, right? Information sharing, snooping into people's mail. There was such immense opposition to Bill C-2 that what the Liberals did is they separated out what they thought would be less controversial provisions, the ones specifically targeting immigrants and refugees, into a whole new bill, right? So the bill that is targeting all Canadians' privacy, all Canadians' civil liberties, all Canadians impacted by surveillance, is now seen as more controversial and will pass in the new year, or will try to get pushed through in the new year. But so Bill C-2, which is really relying on Canadians to succumb to anti-migrant racism and not care about what's happening to migrants, has been separated out into this new bill, C-12. What C-12 does, and it's happening right now, it's being pushed through Parliament, It creates a massive machinery of deportation. C-12 allows the deportation of refugees without a hearing. It imposes an arbitrary, retroactive one-year ban on making a refugee claim. It expands the Safe Third Country Agreement, which is Canada's border wall with the US. We think we don't have a border wall, but we do. It's called the Safe Third Agreement. Perhaps most alarmingly, it grants mass immigration status cancellation powers to ministers who can mass revoke immigration streams and mass revoke all kinds of immigration status of people in Canada. So this is all just in the past few months of what we're seeing. So with this kind of resurgent white nationalist, anti-trans, anti-migrant, xenophobic fascism, I really want to emphasize that migrant justice struggles and understanding the nature of the border is not one of a laundry list of issues. The border is actually a central site of struggle. It is not just that the border is a linchpin in fascist and right-wing ideologies, but that fascism is itself constituted through the border. Fascist tendencies and right-wing tendencies require the quotidian state violence of the border. The exclusionary ideas embedded into right-wing thinking of who belongs and who doesn't, who gets to survive and who doesn't, who can live where and under what conditions, is possible because of an enduring global racial apartheid that borders uphold. This is why I want to situate the rest of my talk on truly understanding the nature of the border so that we can understand what it means to fight against Canadian nationalism and against increasing right-wing politics. Because I would argue to be anti-fascist is to be an internationalist, and to be an internationalist is to abolish the border. Bordering regimes operate through the underlying ideologies of us versus them, of who is deserving and who is undeserving, of literally who happens to, by accident of birth, be born into a place that can literally determine your life expectancy. That is the reality of the border. It is an accident of birth that will literally determine how you live, under what conditions, and for how long. In this time of a global health pandemic, for example, borders determines who has access to life-saving vaccines. Because of global vaccine apartheid, maintained through the asymmetries of capitalist profiteering, intellectual property regimes, centuries of imperialist underdevelopment, vaccine hoarding, and border rule, it means that only 17.94% of people in low-income countries have been vaccinated with a single dose. Less than 18%. As we know historically, many immigration laws in Canada have been written through explicit racial exclusion, such as the Chinese Exclusion Act, vagrancy laws that deported the poor or those deemed criminal, which continues today, laws that excluded single women migrants deemed to be sex workers, attacks on labor unionism were carried out through the explicit expulsion of communists and anarchists in this country, and medical examination was and continues to be a basis for excluding disabled migrants. The mass production and social organization of difference is at the heart of border making, which both makes the so-called good versus the so-called bad migrant, as well as maintains the many different kinds of hierarchical orderings amongst all of us that fascism relies on. I would argue that the rhetoric of the productive and legal and good immigrant that we often hear about to oppose the kind of explicit fascist racism, it only exists in relationship to the demonization of the so-called criminal and illegal and bad immigrant. The problem with these kinds of categories is that they are constantly shifting, right? Who is a so-called good immigrant versus who is a so-called bad immigrant is completely contingent on the politics and the rhetoric of the day. It is a shifting barometer that we can never win as a left, right? We can never actually uphold these distinctions because there are political constructions invented and policed as a race-making and property-protecting regime. Black feminist abolitionist Ruthie Wilson Gilmore teaches us that proving one's innocence or respectability within these false constructs is not only frustrating, it is inherently impossible as a political stance. So migrant justice movements must refuse the liberal lure to endorse categories of the good or the desirable migrant as seen in opposition to the so-called bad migrant. We must reject assimilation or labor commodification as the price of neoliberal citizenship, and we absolutely must challenge state borders as legitimate institutions of governance. I fundamentally believe that human beings are not illegal, settler states are illegal. So again, our responses to the far right and escalating fascism cannot be a kind of liberal or neoliberal moralizing about how good immigrants are, or how much they contribute to the economy, or how much immigrants integrate, because these reproduce a kind of racism in of themselves. What we must do is strike at the heart of fascism itself, which is again to be against the border. To be anti-fascist is to be internationalist, is to be border abolitionists. Our enemy today arrives in a limousine and not on a boat. A fiercely internationalist struggle is not against foreigners, but against oppression, against capitalism, against colonialism. Whether they are foreigners or domestic is irrelevant. I want to emphasize this point. Again, liberalism is not the counter to racist nationalism. One of the key other things that liberal multiculturalists and racist nationalists in Canada share is an assumption that racialized communities are bearers of difference. This is the constant idea that those who are racialized continue to live as hyphenated citizens, right? Where are you from? I'm from Edmonton. Where are you really, really from? Edmonton. Where are you really, really from? I don't know. Where are you really, really from, right? And so this idea that migrants and racialized people are continuously the bearers of difference is organized to subtend, not dismantle, racial power. Sarah Ahmed explains, quote, "Strangers are not simply those we do not recognize, but those whom we recognize as strangers," end quote. What does this mean? It means that while liberalism may challenge some negative stereotypes attributed to immigrants by, for example, saying that immigrants contribute to the economy, or immigrants are good for our future, our workforce, or that immigrants who integrate are good, it still recognizes immigrants as strangers who have to prove their belonging, right? So this categorization of immigrants as strangers and outsiders, whether tolerated through liberal multiculturalism or whether marked for exclusion through outright racist nationalism, both still consolidate state governance as synonymous with racial governance, which is why a rigorous analysis of the border itself, rather than simple platitudes like welcoming immigrants or refugees, is what we need in order to transform global fascism. Borders are a foundationally colonial, anti-Black, anti-Indigenous, anti-migrant, and fascist architecture. Let me be clear that borders are constituted through these violences, and that is why they must be abolished. One of the last things I want to say, second last things about the border, is that we often think of immigration politics as a kind of domestic politics, right? That like we, as people in Canada, get to decide how many people we let in, right? Like there has to be a limit. We can't endlessly accept people. It becomes a question of quotas, resources, legality, these kinds of domesticated issues. But the global migration crisis does not happen miraculously. People do not happen to arrive at the border, right? We have to understand that Canada is implicated in the global violences that creates displacement and migration to begin with, which means that we cannot talk about migration politics without talking about internationalism and anti-colonialism and anti-imperialism and anti-capitalism when our policies and our lives are bound up in these violences, right? The reality is that the total number of migrants who actually can move around the world is less than 2%. The vast majority of the world's displaced people who are displaced due to an asymmetry of violence, right? It's not a coincidence that most people who are migrating come from parts of the world that have been and continue to be colonized. It is not a coincidence that the realities of immigration show very clear demarcation between black and brown people and white people. That there is a clear demarcation between those who are working class, peasant, farmers, indigenous communities in the global south and those who largely live in the imperial centers, right? That is the reality of migration. It maps onto very clear lines of colonization. And the vast majority of those who are displaced due to all of these overlapping crises of conquest and capitalism and increasingly climate change move to neighboring countries, if that, are in refugee camps, are immobilized, cannot leave, right? So we're not actually in a migration crisis. We are in a displacement and immobility crisis where most people are forced to live under extreme deprivation. Palestinians, for example, under UN speak, are considered the world's, quote, most protracted refugee population. Why is that? Why are Palestinians the world's most protracted refugee population? Did it just happen? Something happened. What happened? The Nakba, right? Colonization and settler colonialism since 1948 continues to be the enduring reality for Palestinian refugees. And that is why the freedom struggle for Palestine from the river to the sea and for Palestinian right of return are fundamentally linked struggles. And this is why so many movements say, we are here because you are there. We are here because you are there, because we cannot talk about migration as a simply liberal domesticated issue without accounting for global capitalism, without accounting for white supremacy, without accounting for class, without accounting for gender, without accounting for caste, without accounting for imperialism, and so on. Today, these kinds of displacements are escalating with climate disaster. Around the world, an estimated 1 person every 2 seconds. That was 2 seconds. 1 person every 2 seconds is being displaced due to climate catastrophe. And so when we say migration crisis, the reality is that it is unequal. And people are not able to move because border controls are deadly. Border controls like those that Canada is implementing are deadly. And language like migrant crisis or border crisis becomes an excuse to further harden these borders. Anti-migrant racism, like migrants are swarms, migrants are stealing, migrants are tainting our values, all of this kind of rhetoric that gets baked into policy further villainizes migrants and refugees. And we have to understand this is a crisis not of the border, but due to the border. And again, a border that upholds global racial apartheid. I come back to who has the right to live and under what conditions. That is what the border upholds. People are not illegal. People are made illegal by border policies that are continuously changing, right? Someone who is documented today can literally become illegal by the stroke of a pen. Ontario right now is under day 5 of protests by migrants because the Ford government literally overnight canceled its nominee program. People who had status under this program are now overnight, 2,500 people are in limbo because the government has decided this program is now no longer existing, right? So again, it's a shifting marker that we can't abide by. The racial colonial pillar of bordering regimes is apparent in the global welcome for white Ukrainian refugees and Trump's settlement of white Afrikaners, in glaring contrast to this immobilization and criminalization of Palestinian, Sudanese, Congolese, Syrian, Rohingya, Afghan, Haitian, and Roma refugees in particular. The other thing to note about borders is that they're not a line on a map. You know, we often think of like the border as this line on a map that demarcates territory. But the reality is the border is elastic, and this line can literally exist anywhere. The United States, for example, is increasingly calling its border, not even its border, but it is claiming that its border. It's saying that its southern border is the southern border of Mexico. That's what it calls its southern border. Mexico now deports more Central Americans than the United States does. How does it do it? Because the US is funding border enforcement deep into Central America and has basically funded and built up a detention center system in Mexico that is now one of the largest in the world. This is also how we see all of the border deaths that we hear about in the Mediterranean, which is the deadliest border in the world. The route that the Freedom Flotilla sailed on is the deadliest for migrants in the world. And you may have seen images of the Freedom Flotilla coming in contact with migrants and rescue operations. There is nothing inherently dangerous about moving. Most of us in this room can probably travel with a lot of luxury, right? And access. But the reality is that borders have made it so that certain people's journeys are more perilous. And it does it by outsourcing borders. So the EU has made it so that its border controls now exist far into Asia, far into the Sahel region of Africa, so that migrants that are crossing now die crossing the deserts of Libya. The RSF in Sudan was first funded by, anyone know? The European Union. To do what? Stop migrants. To stop migrants from crossing through Sudan to get across the Mediterranean into the EU. The EU was one of the first major backers of the RSF through the Khartoum process in 2015 that basically funded African countries to ensure that no migrants could cross through the Mediterranean. There is no single trade or aid agreement between the EU and the majority of African states today that does not make funding contingent on migration prevention. Migration prevention, right? So this border is increasingly outsourced, and literally the violence of borders is globalizing all around the world. It is not just the countries like Canada or the US or the EU. The frontiers of borders is now countries like Sudan, like Libya, like Mexico, like Rwanda, like Turkey, like El Salvador, like Guatemala, and so many more. And so this is the reality of the border. The outsourcing of border violence is globalizing the violence of borders and is also becoming an additional means of preserving global imperialism, because countries are now increasingly forced to adopt these carceral mechanisms. And this is also true of Canada. I want to remind us that when we're talking about migrants and refugees who are arriving to Canada, that this is fundamentally linked to Canadian violence as well. As we know, Canada has an intensive resource extractive economy, one that is heavily dependent on the extraction of resources locally and globally. 75% of the world's mining companies are headquartered in Canada, many where I live in so-called Vancouver. There's literally no continent where a Canadian mining company or its subsidiary does not operate. And as we know, many of these companies are notorious for rights violations and for poisoning the water and for displacing entire communities. Companies like Goldcorp's Marlin mine in Guatemala was called the project of death by local communities for leaching cyanide in approximately 250,000 liters of water a day. Companies like Imperial Metals, responsible for the Mount Polley disaster in Secwepemc territory, one of the worst mining disasters in Canadian history. Companies like Nevsun, who were sued by Eritreans for literal modern-day slavery and torture. There is a report by the Prospectors and Developers Association of Canada, the mining lobby group itself. It's not even a left organization. And this organization, in one of its recent reports, themselves have confirmed that Canadian mining corporations are responsible for almost half of all of the documented mining-related violation rights around the world. So how does this connect to migration in Canada? I have many stories, but I want to share one. And I share it often because it's just so stark, which is several years ago, a number of us were contacted through a migrant justice organization, Collective, by family members of undocumented workers who were picked up by CBSA in an immigration raid on a construction site. They were picked up, and amongst these detained workers were two cousins who told us that they had fled their home villages in Honduras because their uncle had been involved in a fight against a Canadian mining company. One of the ones I've named, you can figure out which one, as well as a number of other forces that were usurping their land in their village and their home community. And their family had become a target because of their uncle's involvement. So they fled, and they eventually made their way to Canada. When they arrived, they asked, as many migrants do, how do I seek safety in Canada? They were told, and rightfully so, that you cannot tell a story about fleeing violence that involved a Canadian mining company to a Canadian IRB judge. So there was no way that a refugee judge would buy that story, because it would have to mean that Canada would accept that refugees were fleeing persecution that Canada effectively caused. And so they told the more palatable and stereotypical story of fleeing drug traffickers, the trope of Latin American violence, right? But this wasn't their story. This wasn't why they had actually fled. So it was found to be not credible. They failed their refugee hearing. They became undocumented. They worked underground on a construction site. They got picked up by a CBSA raid. I think about these two young guys and many others so often, because when we hear about news stories, what does the news story suggest? Does the news story ever tell us all of this backstory? No, right? What the news story tells us is quote-unquote illegals here in Canada illegally, rightfully detained and deported, right? So this is the anti-migrant racism that we are fed without any of the violences that we as Canadians are implicated in. I want to say that perhaps most ironically and offensively about the migration crisis, as it's called, is that it's declared a new crisis with primarily Western countries positioned as its victims, even though for 4 centuries, nearly 80 million Europeans became settler colonists across the Americas and Oceania. 4 million indentured laborers were scattered across the globe from Asia, and the transatlantic slave trade kidnapped and enslaved 15 million Africans. Colonialism, genocide, slavery, indentureship, and extraction are completely erased in current invocations of the so-called migrant crisis, even though they are the very conditions of possibility of this so-called crisis. And that is what makes all of this rhetoric about anti-migrant racism so deeply offensive. The last thing that I want to say about this, and this is turning back to why it is so important when we're thinking about opposing Canadian nationalism and thinking about opposing border imperialism, is its relationship to racial capitalism. As I hope I've made clear, migrants are precisely what capitalism requires. As we know, capitalism continuously requires consistently segmented pools of labor that can become cheapened. And I very deliberately here do not say cheap labor, because there is no such thing as cheap labor. All labor is valuable, and all labor is dignified work. What we have is a system of capitalism, specifically racial capitalism, that cheapens labor through constant segmentation and exploitation and division. And so what borders do, and what anti-migrant racism does, is it's not actually intended to exclude all people. It is intended to create the precarity that capitalism relies on. Can anyone guess, before the US Border Patrol was formally the US Border Patrol, what department it fell under in the United States? Labor, the Department of Labor. This very clear connection between migration and racial capitalism. It was actually overseen by the Department of Labor. And so what the border does is the border acts as a spatial fix for capitalism by basically segmenting the labor force. In the United States, one study found that 52% of companies that were going through union drives had their union drives squashed by the companies threatening to call immigration. So the border works in the interests of capital and not against it. And at this juncture in Canada, it is so crucial to understand this, because not only is anti-migrant xenophobia racist, it is also against the interest of the entire global working class. Those on the Canadian nationalist left who believe that somehow more border enforcement or more immigration restrictions are better for citizen workers are completely misdirected. Migrant workers do not suppress wages, bosses and borders do. While workers are declared illegal, like the two cousins I just talked about, the surplus value that they create is never deemed illegal. In fact, that surplus value is exactly what maintains capitalist profits. And so in order for capital to flow freely across borders, it requires immobilized labor, which is what immigration in Canada is basically entirely about. A permanent state of temporariness where migrants and migrant labor is essential to capitalism, and migrants are increasingly vulnerable because of an increasingly racist environment. And so in this way, it becomes so important to build internationalist solidarity. And I want to end on this, how important it is to build internationalist solidarity with all struggles fighting against colonialism and capitalism. And specifically in Canada today, it means that all left movements must echo the call for full immigration status for all workers, which will basically make the border obsolete, which is exactly why I am a border abolitionist. Because an injury to one, as we know, is an injury to all. And we absolutely can fight for a world in which all of the walls and all of the cages will fall so that we have collective liberation in our lifetime. Thank you.
Wow, well, thank you, Harsha, for your powerful and important presentation. So we now have 20 precious minutes left for some participatory discussion and some Q&A.
I am totally conflicted right now as an immigrant and a Canadian. And I don't even know to what extent that conflict is. But what you discussed this afternoon is something that is going to be percolating for a long time with me. My question is, how do one marry being Canadian and being nationalistic with being an immigrant?
I can take a few at a time.
Okay.
Thank you for that.
I'm conflicted as well. Recently, I volunteered with the Forever Canadian petition, which was fighting the separatists here in Alberta. On one hand, I'm saying, forever Canadian, those words are totally in conflict with what you're suggesting, get rid of borders and internationalism. Just curious, maybe your thoughts on that.
I think a lot of people are sort of raised and indoctrinated into this nationalist mindset, right? Especially like white people in Canada. I think it can be hard to conceive something like a world without borders, like what you're advocating for. And I was hoping you could maybe elaborate a bit on how that would look in practice.
I have so many thoughts swirling in my mind, but one of them that kind of sticks with me. This is a fairly left-leaning, largely white audience. One of my questions is around this idea about the good immigrant and the bad immigrant. So my parents are immigrants to Canada. They came at a time probably when brown people weren't wanted here anyways, but they kind of kept their heads down, worked, and then sometimes in those communities even I have to counter this narrative that they're we worked so hard to create our reputation. I'm a Sikh Canadian and we worked so hard, and then there's these new people who are coming are doing all these bad things and they're ruining it for all of us. I kind of try to push back against that narrative because I'm I know you want to appeal to the white people who are also descendants of immigrants, BT dubs. We have to remember that we cannot allow ourselves to be separated along those lines. And I'm just wondering, especially coming from Vancouver area where there's large diasporas of many communities. I'm just wondering, is that a place where we need to have more discourse and more discussion as well? I mean, this is a very specific audience, you know what I mean? So I don't know, I'm gonna end it there. Thanks.
Thank you all. Thank you so much for those equally heavy questions and comments. I'm gonna popcorn it just through, so in no particular order, but maybe reverse order. That's true for any kind of community, right? In the sense that no community is a monolith. There's so many strands of thought in different communities, which is why I personally align with a value-based politics more than an identity-based politics, if I could reduce it to that. Although I don't think it's really that, it's not that simple. But we know for a fact that there are so many immigrants who are actually just straight up conservative, like literally in the Conservative Party, for example, and are actively anti-migrant, and also many other things, right? Anti-trans, pro-capital policies, and we see this all around the world. And so for me, I don't think it's necessarily the case that being a migrant makes you pro-migrant. It just might mean that you fought for yourself. Sometimes it can be that. And it doesn't mean that you necessarily have an affinity with all other migrants. I think the other thing that's important to keep in mind, particularly about the Canadian context, is class, right? A lot of immigrants who came in the 70s and 80s were of a different class background than, for example, refugees coming today. So there's like all of these different dynamics. And then, for example, in the South Asian community, caste plays a big role in terms of the differences across generations of people who come. And so I absolutely believe that many migrants can build power. But I think that power is based on a shared analysis. And it's not always the case that migrants who come will have affinity with other migrants. And sometimes there's also, of course, Islamophobia. In Vancouver, because you mentioned Vancouver, some of the, I don't want to say largest, but some of the largest protests against refugees in 2015, 2016, 2018, when Trudeau had his kind of liberal refugees welcome moment, were from right-wing immigrant community members. Some of the largest. It gestures to the same dynamic in any community. We're always diverse. And it doesn't always mean that being a migrant means that you are actually living a pro-migrant philosophy, right? And so that's why I think that pushback is so important, and why we can never take politics for granted simply based on how one may appear. So, and the Black radical tradition teaches us that not all skin folk are kinfolk. That would be my answer. And so I think pushing back at all times is so important. But it means that our entry point may be different, right? It means that the way in which we initiate a conversation may be different. It means that we might say, listen, if you tried to come today, you probably wouldn't make it here. That's the reality. So so many people are so invested in I came here the right way. And that goes back to the idea that the right way is constantly changing. And if you tried today, you probably wouldn't be here, right? And that right way was at the whim of the Canadian government's requirements at that time, right? And it's constantly changing. And so I think holding both of those, like the reality that migrants, having a conversation with migrant communities can offer some starting points, but that it's never a given. We always have to build movements that bring those politics in. Thank you for the question about no borders. The question that this kind of talk always lends itself to is like, isn't a no border politics completely utopic? And like, what are you off about? A few points there. One is I think borders are just so fundamentally entrenched in our psyche that we actually cannot think of a world outside of borders, even though in the context of the world, the vast majority of borders did not exist 100 years ago, right? Most nation-state borders, as we know them today, are embedded in empire, right? Like most continents only had borders the way that we know them now. I'm not talking about natural geography, natural delineations. I'm talking about nation-states. And that to me is the second point. It is crucial to understand that nation-states are completely linked to borders. Right? People have always had a sense of belonging, a sense of community, a sense in connection to land, but that is very different than the nation-state border. Borders are not natural. They do not exist outside of the nation-state construct, which is a completely colonial construct itself, coming out of the World War II post-Philian era, right? And so I think that is important because sometimes people are like, well, how would people just live It's like, no. People have always had a connection to place. Connection to place is not the same as a border. And so for me, a no borders world is very different than an open borders world. So an open borders world is one where we're like, sure, anybody can move anywhere, but the world that we live in stays the same, right? So there are still sacrifice zones. Right? It would mean that the so-called third world and the so-called fourth world are still sites of extraction and exploitation. And that to me is not the same as a no borders world. An open borders world just means that people who are displaced maybe have the right to move. But a no borders world is actually the right to remain, the right to move, and the right to return, which means fundamentally undoing colonialism and capitalism so that people can remain in their homelands, people can live in their communities, and that people can move. The fear of an open border world only exists because we recognize that millions of people are impoverished and desperate. That is the fundamental fear of an open borders world. If we were to live in a truly egalitarian world, would millions of people want to be on the move? Probably not, right? And that to me is the difference between an open borders world that continues to allow the status quo to exist and where this fear-based politics survives, rather than a no-border world that recognizes that all of these systems of oppression are interlinked, and that in order to actually have a truly no-borders world, it means we're dismantling these global systems. And also in terms of the practicality of a no-borders world, two quick answers. One is I think the practicality of a no-borders world is in the movement of migrants themselves who refuse to accept border controls and are still on the move. Despite the fact that people are dying and being killed in the Mediterranean, for example, migrants are still saying, fuck those borders. I'm gonna try to, Parkland, sorry. And are moving, right? Like the literal unsanctioned, ungovernable movement of people as an everyday reality is the refusal of borders and is the living reality of a no borders politics. The second example is the rise across the world of spaces like sanctuary cities, right? The everyday politics of saying, no matter what your papers say, you have a right to access services. That our healthcare center will provide healthcare even if you don't have status. That our school will provide education even if you don't have status. Those kinds of municipal spaces, congregations that accept refugees who are facing removal, that is an everyday practical reality of a no-border politics to me as well. The questions of how does one reconcile this kind of tension between being Canadian and an immigrant and, this kind of internationalism, if I can kind of combine both of your questions together, because they feel similar to me. Again, for me, I would separate out the sense of belonging and community that we share with each other than our attachment to the nation state. Because to me, the attachment to Canada and this vehement attachment to Canada is very different than my kid has a deep sense of belonging to the neighborhood that we live in, to her school, to the municipal institutions, to her public pool, to the public library. Those are all things in the commons, ideally in the commons, that we can all feel belonging to because that is what the commons is meant to be. To me, the idea of the commons is fundamentally different than the nation state and nationalism because the nation state is about enclosures and the Canadian nation state in particular is about colonialism and imperialism. For me, I don't see a huge contradiction in feeling a sense of belonging to a place and to a community than I do to a Canadian nationalism that at this point is just at a stage of such violence and carcerality and no regard for public services other than the carceral public service, other than the police and the military and border services, that it completely disregards the well-being of people, that has no regard for seniors, no regard for disabled people, has no regard for migrant workers who labor every single day and produce our food. And the irony of right now in this moment of buy Canadian is 40% of Canadian companies that we think are Canadian are actually not even Canadian. Food that we are eating, that we're being told is from Canadian grocers, many of them are exploiting migrant labor who the Canadian state is trying to kick out. Right? So the Canadian state is embedded in its own narrative of a nationalism that is at the same time exploiting so many people and is also actually not very nationalist itself. There's a hypocrisy in it. For me, I turn back to my internationalism is rooted in solidarity with people's struggles. And my solidarity, for example, right now, it's not against the people of the US. It's not against indigenous peoples colonized by the United States. It's not against poor people or incarcerated people in the United States. It's the elite. And that is the same fight against the elite here That is the same fight against elite everywhere, right? So for me, internationalism is how we grow solidarity with people's struggles. And that to me is much more productive at this time and place of global history than a false nationalism that somehow assumes I have something in common with Mark Carney, which I absolutely don't.
Hi. Can you speak a little bit about the language of expat as it's used by Western nations as a tool of separation from the causal factors of the need for migration? And can you also speak a little bit about how the inability of white people to connect to the land that they're on as opposed to a nation state actually exacerbates the reliance on capital for identity?
Thank you. And I think for so many folks, white people in particular, but I think for so many people, one of the most significant impacts of capitalism and colonialism as they are conjoined is alienation, right? That's alienation from land. And of course, being thoughtful here that, a sense of belonging to land, we can't perpetuate settler colonialism in this conversation around belonging to land, but alienation from land, sorry, go ahead.
At some point, we have to start accepting that people who may have at one point been settler colonizers have nowhere to go.
That may be the case, but dismantling settler colonialism is not around people's ability to move. It's around dismantling a settler colonial system. And that settler colonial system is one that maintains Indigenous genocide today. It is one where absolutely everybody with capital, except for Indigenous peoples, has a right to buy property and can claim a right to land. Indigenous people are forced onto less than 0.2% of what is so-called Canada because of a colonial reserve system, because of a system of immobility that forces Indigenous people onto the reserve system. I absolutely think land back is central. I don't think settler governance over Indigenous lands is a decolonial way forward. I think it is Indigenous governance over Indigenous lands. That's what land back means to me, that I understand from Indigenous peoples. And I think Indigenous governance is foundational to understanding what anti-colonialism and anti-capitalism will actually look like in our futures, because we are talking about communal ways of being and stewardship, right? Like, one of the things of capitalism and colonialism is that it alienates people from each other, right? Like, we have turned into like social media commodity. I mean, I'm not preaching here, I'm bad too. But we've all turned into consumers, right? We are like alienated citizens who have alienated labor and have alienated relations. We literally think social media is the real world. We are more likely to be sitting on transit looking and scrolling than we are to be talking to the person next to us on transit. And that complete degradation of social relationships is exactly as you said, is what capitalism relies on, right? The antithesis to capitalism is community. That is not a cliche. That is what allows us to extricate ourselves from capitalism, because we have the bonds that allow us to survive. That means that we don't have to like rely on the gig economy for all of our survival needs, because we have people in our lives that can support us. And so absolutely, the social relations that currently are completely alienated is so central to how we overcome capitalism and colonialism. And the language of expat is a great thing to notice, because we know that there are many people on the move who are not considered part of the so-called migrant and refugee crisis. Expats, diplomats, tourists, right? Like all of these kinds of categories that are celebrated. And why are they celebrated? Because they represent the settler mobility on the one hand versus criminalized immobility on the other. The migration crisis is not about all movement. It is about criminalizing certain movement. And in fact, more people are on the move today than ever were before. It's just that they are not criminalized. They're on airplanes, they're on yachts, they're Airbnb-ing their way around the literal world, like fucking Columbus 3.0, right? But like, that is not the migrant crisis, because those are like hipsters that we're supposed to be grateful for revitalizing economies, or gentrifiers that were, who are literally the new pioneers. And so that is why it is impossible to separate out migration from colonialism and capitalism, because it is not about people moving. It is about people who move in ways that reproduce and benefit from capitalism and colonialism.
You talk about internationalism, and I just was wondering if you would be able to expand on that a bit. I feel like that really is something that I identify with and I feel like drawn to, but I think that I have a level of ignorance. And I'm wondering if you could just expand on what internationalism means to you.
Sure.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And then last question.
Oh,
Yeah.
thanks. I absolutely 100% agree with your anti-capitalism sentiment. I think it's the root of all evil. So what I want to know from you is you talk about the dismantling of the system, of the structures, of absolute colonialism that has absolutely been the tool of capitalism worldwide. When you talk about the dismantling of the capitalistic structures, how do you foresee this happening?
These epic questions. Internationalism for me is a political tradition of solidarity that expresses solidarity with all oppressed people's struggles around the world. And that to me is internationalism. And so it is a kind of solidarity from below, rather than a kind of idea that we have solidarity with the elite or nation states, but it's like with specific people's struggles, right? So that for me is why, for example, internationalism doesn't necessarily mean I have to hold on to some identity as a Canadian that is right now in a fight with the United States because I have solidarity with incarcerated people. I have solidarity with houseless people in the US. I have solidarity with worker struggles in the US. So that is how I would position myself as an internationalist in this moment of Canada-US trade war, for example. And recognizing that the problem is actually NAFTA. Right? And every iteration of NAFTA that is capitalist trade, it's not actually an issue with people who happen to reside on the other side of a colonially imposed border. So that was a quick answer. And then amplified around the world. Dismantling capitalism. I don't know, that's why we're here. Dismantling capitalism also, I think, looks differently in different places. But I think it means solidarity with all of the struggles of people who are the victims of capitalism. So the kind of most obvious ones are often workers, right? So supporting unions all the time, labor on strike, supporting the picket line, ensuring that unions actually serve the workers and give up on business and service unionism and actually become a fighting tool for the working class. But I think fights against capitalism are also fights for social housing, right? The spear of anti-capitalist struggles today are not just on the shop floor. They're also against the commodification of literally everything. Indigenous struggles to defend the land are struggles against resource extraction conducted by capitalist and colonial interests. Fight for housing rights and for rent controls are fights against capitalists. Fights for price controls on groceries are fights against capitalism. Fights for migrant workers' rights and for status for immigrants is a fight against capitalism. And so I think the biggest piece that I can offer is seeing the many interconnected ways in which capitalism is embedded in all of our different struggles that we often considered silos, right? Feminist struggles have always understood that capitalism is central to the reproduction of labor. And so to see the connections between what are often considered separate struggles, I think is how we actually dismantle capitalism, is through seeing solidarity and acting in ways that moves us through solidarity so that we refuse to be pitted against each other, right? So that we refuse to buy into, again, in this moment, anti-migrant racism. We refuse to buy into anti-poor rhetoric that calls for more law and order. That is a complete gutting of public services for the benefit of the carceral state. And we refuse anti-trans logic. I think those three are the current pillars of what it would mean to dismantle capitalism, even though they may not be on the surface be seen as anti-capitalist fights.
What a brilliant way to end. What a powerful presentation. And thank you for all of your questions and presence here, folks here, and also to those offline. Huge thanks to our presenter, Harsha Walia, and to everybody who is here.